May 12, 1945, Camp Stark, New Hampshire. Dr. Friedrich Müller's hands trembled as he stood in the doorway of what Americans called a prisoner infirmary. He had expected wooden cots and rusted surgical scissors salvaged from battlefield kits. Instead, his eyes fixed on something that made his breath catch. A Westinghouse X-ray machine, model 1944, its chrome surface gleaming under fluorescent lights he hadn't seen since before the war. Behind him, 3 other German army surgeons stood frozen. They had operated in Berlin's Charité Hospital, once Europe's finest, where by 1944 they were reusing bandages and performing amputations without anesthesia. They had watched their colleagues die from infections they couldn't treat because penicillin was a rumor whispered in medical journals. And now, here in a camp for captured enemies in the woods of rural America, they were staring at equipment that didn't exist even in their pre-war fantasies. Dr. Hans Werner broke the silence, his voice barely above a whisper. Das ist unmöglich. That's impossible. But it wasn't impossible. It was just America. And over the next 6 months, these German doctors would confront a truth more devastating than any military defeat. The industrial chasm between their world and this one wasn't measured in weapons or tanks. It was measured in how a nation treated its enemies when no one was watching. This is the story of that shock. The moment when Nazi Germany's medical elite discovered that their captors' POW camps had better health care than the Reich's best hospitals. And the profound psychological earthquake that followed. April 28, 1945, somewhere over the Atlantic Ocean. The C-47 transport rattled through turbulence, and Dr. Friedrich Müller pressed his forehead against the cold metal frame, watching clouds fragment below. 43 years old, a major in the Wehrmacht Medical Corps, he had spent 4 months in British custody after his field hospital was overrun in the Ardennes. Now he was being transferred to America, and his mind churned through everything he'd been told to expect. The propaganda had been specific. American camps were death factories designed to finish what the battlefield started. Jews ran them naturally, thirsting for revenge. Prisoners starved on bread and water. Medical care was non-existent. Those who fell ill were left to die, or worse, used for medical experiments, the Americans' crude attempt to mimic German medical advancement. Müller didn't entirely believe the propaganda. He'd stopped believing most things in late 1944 when he'd watched a 16-year-old boy die of gangrene because they had no sulfa drugs left, while party officials assured him that final victory was imminent. But he did believe in scarcity. Everyone believed in scarcity. It was the universal law of wartime existence. Across from him sat Dr. Hans Werner, 38, a surgical specialist who'd published papers on arterial reconstruction before the war consumed such luxuries as academic journals. Werner's left hand was missing 2 fingers, lost to frostbite during the retreat from Kharkov. He hadn't spoken since they left England. Next to Werner, Dr. Klaus Zimmermann, 51, older, grayer, the former chief of surgery at Munich's teaching hospital. Before the war, he'd trained in Vienna under Billroth's successors. Now his face was a map of exhaustion, deep lines cutting from nose to jaw. And young Dr. Peter Hoffman, just 29, who'd been conscripted straight from his residency in 1942 and had never known medicine except in field hospitals where you operated under artillery fire and counted success by whether your patient survived the night. 4 German surgeons, 4 men who had once believed they represented the pinnacle of medical science, the inheritors of Virchow and Koch and Röntgen. 4 men who were about to discover they knew nothing. The plane descended into New Jersey at dawn. May was blooming across America, a May without bombing raids or food shortages or the smell of burning cities. Müller noted this with the part of his mind still trained to observe clinical details. The guards who processed them were polite, bored even, filling out forms in triplicate. No beatings, no interrogations, just paperwork and a bus ride north. They arrived at Camp Stark, New Hampshire in the afternoon. The camp sprawled across former civilian conservation corps facilities, wooden barracks arranged in neat rows, surrounded by pine forests that seemed to stretch forever. about 2,400 German POWs, mostly captured in France and Italy. The camp had been operational since 1944, housing prisoners who worked in local lumber mills and farms. Müller expected to be sent to the barracks. Instead, a U.S. Army captain named Morrison met them at the administration building. Morrison spoke decent German, learned from immigrant grandparents in Wisconsin. "You're physicians?" Morrison asked, consulting a clipboard. "Yes," Müller answered. "Surgeons." "Good. We need you in the infirmary. Our camp doctor's been handling everything, but with your medical background—" Morrison paused, seeming to search for words. "Well, you'll see. Come with me." They followed Morrison across the compound. Prisoners in their distinctive PW-marked uniforms nodded as they passed. No one looked starved. No one looked beaten. They looked ordinary. Bored young men waiting for history to release them. The infirmary was a longer building set apart from the main barracks. Morrison held the door open. And that's when Friedrich Müller's world cracked open. The smell hit him first. Not the smell he expected, not the rot and gangrene stench of field hospitals or the carbolic acid burn of desperate disinfection. This was clean, antiseptic clean. The kind of clean he remembered from 1938, before everything fell apart. Then the light, fluorescent tubes, bright and steady, no flickering, no shadows. He hadn't seen lights like this since before the blackouts became permanent. Then the equipment. Morrison was saying something about procedures and schedules, but Müller wasn't listening. He was staring at the X-ray machine. It wasn't just any X-ray machine. It was new. It was American, a Westinghouse radiographic unit, model 300A. He knew because he'd seen technical drawings in a confiscated American journal in 1942 and spent 2 weeks fantasizing about what such equipment could do. The machine in Berlin's Charité, where he'd trained, was a 1936 Siemens that broke down monthly and produced films so grainy they were often useless. This machine looked like it had been installed yesterday. The chrome gleamed. The cables were wrapped in perfect insulation. The control panel had labels in English, crisp and clear. "We installed that last year," Morrison said, noticing Müller's stare. "The old portable unit wasn't cutting it. Too many fractures from the lumber work. We needed better diagnostic capability." Too many fractures. Better diagnostic capability. The words floated past Müller like debris from a sinking ship. He moved deeper into the room, his trained eye cataloging everything. An autoclave, modern, electric, gleaming stainless steel. In Germany, by 1944, they'd been boiling instruments in salvaged pots over wood fires, surgical instrument trays, complete sets, organized by procedure type, scalpels with disposable blades. Disposable. He tried to remember the last time he'd used a disposable anything. Rows of glass-fronted cabinets lined one wall. Müller approached them slowly, afraid they might vanish if he moved too quickly. Inside, medications. Bottles and bottles of medications, labeled in English, organized by classification. Sulfa drugs, morphine, ether, antiseptics. And there, on the third shelf, a sight that made his hands shake. Small glass vials with yellow labels. Penicillin. Not one vial. Not a precious reserve carefully guarded for the most desperate cases. Dozens of vials. A full box. Sitting on a shelf in a prisoner of war camp infirmary, like it was aspirin. "Is something wrong?" Morrison asked. Müller realized he was gripping the edge of the cabinet. Werner had come up beside him, staring at the same shelf. Werner's remaining fingers were white where they pressed against the glass. "The penicillin," Müller said in English, his accent thick. This is all for prisoners." Morrison looked genuinely puzzled. "Of course. We've had good results with it. Cut our infection mortality rate by 80% since we started using it regularly last fall. Do you have experience with penicillin administration?" Müller couldn't answer. In Germany, penicillin had been almost mythical. He'd heard of it, read about it in captured American medical journals. The Allies were mass-producing it, treating infections that would have been death sentences with a few injections. But seeing it here, in such quantity, used so casually. Werner found his voice. "In Germany," he said slowly, "I never saw penicillin, not once, not in 4 years of war." The silence that followed was profound. Zimmerman had moved to examine the surgical area. 2 full operating tables with overhead lighting. Again, bright, steady, modern. Anesthesia equipment, a complete set of orthopedic instruments for bone surgery, splinting materials, plaster, gauze in quantities that seemed absurd. In Berlin by 1943, they'd been washing and reusing gauze until it fell apart. Young Hoffman stood in the center of the room, slowly turning in a circle, his face slack with incomprehension. Morrison, to his credit, seemed to recognize something was happening, but didn't quite understand what. "I'll show you the pharmacy storage next," he said. "We keep the main supplies in a separate locked room, climate-controlled. Some of the medications require specific temperature ranges. Climate-controlled storage for prisoner medication." They followed Morrison to the pharmacy. The small room contained metal shelving units packed with supplies. Müller's training automatically cataloged antibiotics, analgesics, anesthetics, vitamins, antiseptics, cardiac medications, respiratory medications, dermatological treatments, supplies sufficient for a small hospital, for prisoners. "We also have a dental suite," Morrison continued, leading them down a short hallway. "The Army considers dental health a component of overall health management, so—" The dental room contained 2 full chairs, modern drilling equipment, an X-ray unit specifically for dental imaging, and a complete set of dental surgical instruments. There was even a supply of gold for fillings. Gold, for dental work, for German prisoners. Müller felt something breaking inside his chest. Not his heart, something harder, more structural. The architecture of understanding he'd built over 4 decades, the framework that organized reality into categories of possible and impossible, superior and inferior, us and them. "I don't understand," young Hoffman said. His voice cracked. "Why?" It was the right question, the only question. Why would America, locked in total war, build hospitals for its enemies that exceeded anything Germany provided for its own soldiers? Morrison seemed surprised by the question. "The Geneva Convention requires adequate medical care for prisoners of war. We take those requirements seriously." The Geneva Convention. Müller almost laughed. Germany had signed the Geneva Convention, and then in practice had treated it like every other international agreement, as words on paper, quaint and irrelevant when measured against necessity. The field hospitals he'd worked in barely had resources for German soldiers, let alone captured enemies. But this wasn't about conventions or requirements. This was about capacity. This was about a nation so wealthy, so industrially powerful, that it could afford to provide enemy prisoners with medical care that exceeded what the Reich provided its own citizens. That night, in the barracks assigned to medical staff, Müller lay awake listening to Werner's breathing in the bunk below. Outside, somewhere in the New Hampshire darkness, an owl called. Spring in America. Spring in a country where the factories ran day and night, where the lights stayed on, where hospitals had equipment and medications and supplies that simply materialized from an apparently bottomless cornucopia of industrial production. He thought about Berlin, about the Charité Hospital in 1944, where they'd operated by candlelight during blackouts, where they'd reused sutures until they broke, where they'd watched patients die from infections they could have prevented with drugs that didn't exist in Germany, but were sitting on a shelf in a New Hampshire prisoner camp. He thought about the propaganda they'd been fed for years, about German technical superiority, about the subhuman nature of their enemies, about how the Reich represented the pinnacle of human achievement. And he thought about that box of penicillin sitting casually on a shelf, used so regularly they needed to restock it monthly. That was the first shock. But it was only the beginning. The smell hit him first. Not the smell he expected, not the rotten gangrene stench of field hospitals or the carbolic acid burn of desperate disinfection. This was clean, antiseptic clean, the kind of clean he remembered from 1938, before everything fell apart. Then the light. Fluorescent tubes, bright and steady, no flickering, no shadows. He hadn't seen lights like this since before the blackouts became permanent. Then the equipment. Morrison was saying something about procedures and schedules, but Müller wasn't listening. He was staring at the X-ray machine. It wasn't just any X-ray machine. It was new. It was American, a Westinghouse radiographic unit, Model 300A. He knew because he'd seen technical drawings in a confiscated American journal in 1942 and spent 2 weeks fantasizing about what such equipment could do. The machine in Berlin's Charité, where he'd trained, was a 1936 Siemens that broke down monthly and produced films so grainy they were often useless. This machine looked like it had been installed yesterday. The chrome gleamed. The cables were wrapped in perfect insulation. The control panel had labels in English, crisp and clear. "We installed that last year," Morrison said, noticing Müller's stare. The old portable unit wasn't cutting it. Too many fractures from the lumber work. We needed better diagnostic capability. Too many fractures. Better diagnostic capability. The words floated past Müller like debris from a sinking ship. He moved deeper into the room, his trained eye cataloging everything. An autoclave. Modern, electric, gleaming stainless steel. In Germany by 1944, they'd been boiling instruments in salvaged pots over wood fires, surgical instrument trays, complete sets, organized by procedure type. Scalpels with disposable blades. Disposable. He tried to remember the last time he'd used a disposable anything. Rows of glass-fronted cabinets lined one wall. Müller approached them slowly, afraid they might vanish if he moved too quickly. Inside, medications. Bottles and bottles of medications, labeled in English, organized by classification, sulfa drugs, morphine, ether, antiseptics. And there, on the third shelf, a sight that made his hands shake. Small glass vials with yellow labels. Penicillin, not one vial. Not a precious reserve, carefully guarded for the most desperate cases. Dozens of vials. A full box. Sitting on a shelf in a prisoner of war camp infirmary, like it was aspirin. "Is something wrong?" Morrison asked. Müller realized he was gripping the edge of the cabinet. Werner had come up beside him, staring at the same shelf. Werner's remaining fingers were white where they pressed against the glass. "The penicillin," Müller said in English, his accent thick. This is all for prisoners?" Morrison looked genuinely puzzled. "Of course. We've had good results with it. Cut our infection mortality rate by 80% since we started using it regularly last fall. Do you have experience with penicillin administration?" Müller couldn't answer. In Germany, penicillin had been almost mythical. He'd heard of it, read about it in captured American medical journals. The Allies were mass-producing it, treating infections that would have been death sentences with a few injections. But seeing it here in such quantity, used so casually. Werner found his voice. "In Germany," he said slowly, "I never saw penicillin, not once, not in 4 years of war." The silence that followed was profound. Zimmerman had moved to examine the surgical area. 2 full operating tables with overhead lighting, again bright, steady, modern, anesthesia equipment, a complete set of orthopedic instruments for bone surgery, splinting materials, plaster, gauze in quantities that seemed absurd. In Berlin, by 1943, they'd been washing and reusing gauze until it fell apart. Young Hoffman stood in the center of the room, slowly turning in a circle, his face slack with incomprehension. Morrison, to his credit, seemed to recognize something was happening, but didn't quite understand what. "I'll show you the pharmacy storage next," he said. "We keep the main supplies in a separate locked room, climate-controlled. Some of the medications require specific temperature ranges. Climate-controlled storage. For prisoner medication, they followed Morrison to the pharmacy. The small room contained metal shelving units packed with supplies. Müller's training automatically cataloged antibiotics, analgesics, anesthetics, vitamins, antiseptics, cardiac medications, respiratory medications, dermatological treatments. Supplies sufficient for a small hospital. For prisoners. We also have a dental suite, Morrison continued, leading them down a short hallway. The Army considers dental health a component of overall health management, so... The dental room contained 2 full chairs, modern drilling equipment, an X-ray unit specifically for dental imaging, and a complete set of dental surgical instruments. There was even a supply of gold for fillings. Gold. For dental work. For German prisoners. Müller felt something breaking inside his chest. Not his heart. Something harder, more structural. The architecture of understanding he'd built over 4 decades, the framework that organized reality into categories of possible and impossible, superior and inferior, us and them. "I don't understand," young Hoffman said. His voice cracked. Why? It was the right question, the only question. Why would America, locked in total war, build hospitals for its enemies that exceeded anything Germany provided for its own soldiers? Morrison seemed surprised by the question. The Geneva Convention requires adequate medical care for prisoners of war. We take those requirements seriously. The Geneva Convention. Müller almost laughed. Germany had signed the Geneva Convention, and then in practice had treated it like every other international agreement, as words on paper, quaint and irrelevant when measured against necessity. The field hospitals he'd worked in barely had resources for German soldiers, let alone captured enemies. But this wasn't about conventions or requirements. This was about capacity. This was about a nation so wealthy, so industrially powerful, that it could afford to provide enemy prisoners with medical care that exceeded what the Reich provided its own citizens. That night, in the barracks assigned to medical staff, Müller lay awake listening to Werner's breathing in the bunk below. Outside, somewhere in the New Hampshire darkness, an owl called. Spring in America. Spring in a country where the factories ran day and night, where the light stayed on, where hospitals had equipment and medications and supplies that simply materialized from an apparently bottomless cornucopia of industrial production. He thought about Berlin, about the Charité Hospital in 1944, where they'd operated by candlelight during blackouts, where they'd reused sutures until they broke, where they'd watched patients die from infections they could have prevented with drugs that didn't exist in Germany but were sitting on a shelf in a New Hampshire prisoner camp. He thought about the propaganda they'd been fed for years, about German technical superiority, about the subhuman nature of their enemies, about how the Reich represented the pinnacle of human achievement. And he thought about that box of penicillin sitting casually on a shelf, used so regularly they needed to restock it monthly. That was the first shock. But it was only the beginning. The next morning, Morrison introduced them to Captain Robert Chen, the camp's chief medical officer. Chen was a second-generation Chinese-American from San Francisco, 34 years old, who'd completed his medical training at Johns Hopkins before the war. This fact alone required mental adjustment. In Germany, the idea of a Chinese doctor would have been dismissed as absurd, a fundamental violation of racial hierarchy. Chen spoke precisely, like a man accustomed to teaching. "Gentlemen, welcome. I understand you're all experienced surgeons. That's excellent. We have about 1,400 prisoners in this camp, and the medical needs are substantial, not just acute care. We're also responsible for preventive medicine, chronic condition management, and health maintenance for prisoners. Our primary challenges," Chen continued, "are work-related injuries. We have details working in lumber operations, and fractures and lacerations are common. We also see a fair amount of respiratory infection, particularly in winter. The cold here can be brutal if you're not acclimated. And we have several prisoners with chronic conditions that require ongoing management. Diabetes, cardiac issues, that sort of thing. Diabetes management. 4 prisoners. Chen pulled out a chart. I keep detailed medical records on every prisoner. Health history, treatments, outcomes. The data's useful for tracking trends and improving care protocols. For example, we noticed an uptick in vitamin D deficiency last winter, so we've implemented supplementation programs." He handed the chart to Müller. It was meticulous. Patient name, medical history, every consultation, every treatment, every medication prescribed, all documented in clean, methodical handwriting. Müller had tried to keep records in the field hospitals, but it had been impossible. Supplies appeared and vanished randomly. Patients died before you could document their condition. Record-keeping seemed like a luxury from another world. "Today I'll have you observe our procedures," Chen said. "Tomorrow you can begin assisting. Within a week, I expect you'll be able to handle most routine cases independently." The day became a cascade of small revelations. A young German private came in with the infected laceration on his forearm, a wood splinter injury from the mill. Chen examined it, cleaned it, and administered penicillin. The entire process took 15 minutes. In Germany, that injury would have meant days of fever, possibly amputation if the infection spread, probably death if they didn't have even basic antibiotics. The private thanked Chen in halting English. Chen nodded, made notes in the record, and scheduled a follow-up for 3 days later. "The injury's not severe," Chen explained to Müller, who was observing, "but we've learned that aggressive early treatment prevents most serious complications. The penicillin costs us maybe $2 per treatment. The alternative, if infection becomes systemic, would require weeks of intensive care if he survived at all. Economically and medically, prevention makes more sense. Economically, the word hung in the air." Chen was calculating the cost-benefit analysis of treating a German prisoner. The casual assumption that medicine should be economically rational, that saving lives was an accounting problem with an obvious solution. In Germany, they'd made different calculations. The cost of treating certain categories of people had been weighed against their productive value to the state, and the mathematics of that calculation had led to places Müller tried not to think about. Later that morning, an older prisoner, a sergeant, maybe 45, came in complaining of chest pain. Chen immediately performed an EKG. Another machine Müller hadn't seen since before the war, sitting in a prisoner camp infirmary. The reading showed cardiac irregularity. Chen prescribed medication, digitalis, carefully dosed, and explained to the patient in German that he would need to avoid strenuous work for at least 2 weeks. "I'll notify the work detail supervisor," Chen told Morrison, who'd been observing. "We'll assign him to light duty." "Understood," Morrison said, making a note. Müller watched this exchange, trying to process it. A German prisoner, a sergeant who'd probably fought against Americans, was being given cardiac medication and excused from work duty because his heart wasn't functioning optimally. Not because he was dying, he could probably have continued working, but because Chen had determined it was medically inadvisable. The casual humanity of it was staggering. On the third day, Müller accompanied Chen to the dental suite. A German corporal named Franz Becker sat in the chair, nervous, his hand gripping the armrest. "Franz needs 3 fillings," Chen explained. "He's been avoiding dental care for probably 2 years, based on the decay pattern." "We'll do them all today." The American dental technician, a specialist named Thompson, took an X-ray first. The image developed in minutes, showing clear detail of Becker's teeth, the cavities visible as dark spots. In Germany, Müller had watched soldiers lose teeth because dental care was considered non-essential. You could fight with bad teeth. You couldn't fight with a missing leg. The calculus was simple. Resources went to keeping men alive and combat-capable, not comfortable. Thompson administered local anesthetic, Novocaine, in sufficient quantity to ensure Becker felt nothing. Then he began drilling, using a modern high-speed drill that cut quickly and precisely. The filling material was amalgam for the back teeth, gold for one that showed when Becker smiled. The entire process took 90 minutes. When it was done, Becker stood up, touched his jaw cautiously, and said in German, "I can't feel any pain." "The anesthetic will wear off in a few hours," Thompson said through Chen's translation. "Avoid hot foods until then. The fillings will last years if you maintain good hygiene." Becker nodded, still touching his jaw in wonder. Then he did something that made Müller's throat tighten. He shook Thompson's hand, formally, and said, "Danke schön. Thank you for fixing my teeth. Thank you for taking away my pain. Thank you for treating me like a human being whose comfort matters." After Becker left, Chen pulled out a folder. "We've treated about 200 dental cases in the past 6 months," he said. everything from routine fillings to complex extractions. The improvement in general health has been measurable. Fewer infections, better nutrition since prisoners can chew properly. Müller found himself asking the question that had haunted him for 3 days. Why? Why do all this for prisoners? Chen looked at him with something like surprise. Because they're patients. That's what doctors do. It was, Müller realized, a complete answer and no answer at all. Because they're patients, as if that category erased all other categories. Enemy, prisoner, German, other. As if being human and suffering was the only relevant fact. In Germany, categories had been everything. Your race, your political reliability, your usefulness to the state. These determined what you received, whether you lived or died. Medicine had become a tool of ideology, sorting humans into those worth saving and those who weren't. And here was an American Chinese doctor in rural New Hampshire, treating German soldiers who'd tried to kill his countrymen, explaining it with 5 words. Because they're patients. That night, the 4 German doctors sat together in their barracks. Outside, they could hear prisoners talking, laughing even. Someone was playing a harmonica, American folk tunes, learned from the guards. Werner spoke first. My hospital in Dresden, before it was bombed. We had 6 X-ray machines for a city of 600,000 people. They had 1 working machine by late 1944. We shared it with 2 other hospitals. Zimmermann nodded slowly. In Munich, we were reusing sutures, boiling them, sterilizing them as best we could, using them again. I saw 3 patients die from infection introduced by contaminated sutures. We knew, but we had no choice. Young Hoffman's voice was almost a whisper. I never used penicillin. I never even saw it. I watched 17 men die from infections I could have cured if I'd had what's sitting on that shelf. 17. I counted. Müller said nothing. He was thinking about the mathematics again. The industrial capacity required to produce all that equipment, all those medications in sufficient quantity that they could be distributed not just to American soldiers, but to prisoner camps scattered across the country, the organizational capability required to track it all, supply it all, maintain it all. And more than that, the cultural assumption that it should be done, that even enemies deserved medical care. That suffering should be reduced regardless of whose suffering it was. We were told we were superior, Werner said. The master race, the pinnacle of human achievement. And we believed it. I believed it. Did we? Müller asked. Or did we just not question it? The distinction seemed important, though he couldn't articulate why. Zimmermann, the oldest, spoke with the weight of someone who remembered before. Before 1933, German medicine was the finest in the world. Vienna, Berlin, Munich. We trained doctors from everywhere. The Nobel Prizes. The discoveries. Real achievements. He paused, his hands folding and unfolding in his lap. And then we let them destroy it. We didn't resist. We went along. We told ourselves it was temporary or necessary, or that we could work within the system. We watched our Jewish colleagues disappear and told ourselves it wasn't our concern. We saw the euthanasia programs and told ourselves we were only following orders. The silence that followed was absolute. And now, Zimmermann continued, we're in a camp for prisoners, and the medicine here is better than what we provided to our own people. What does that make us? No one answered. Over the following weeks, the education continued. Müller learned that Camp Stark was one of over 500 POW camps scattered across the United States, holding more than 400,000 German prisoners. Each camp had medical facilities. Not all were as well equipped as Stark, but all met standards that would have been impressive in Germany, even before the war. He learned that American medical schools continued operating throughout the war, training new doctors. German universities had been gutted, professors conscripted, students sent to the front, research abandoned. He learned that American pharmaceutical companies had scaled up penicillin production to industrial levels. By 1945, U.S. factories were producing 650 billion units per month. Germany's total production from its few remaining labs effectively zero. He learned that the average American hospital in 1945 had equipment and supplies that German doctors could only dream of. And this wasn't new. It had been true before the war started. The gap hadn't been created by the war. The war had merely revealed it. One afternoon, Morrison showed them a training manual for U.S. Army medics, basic combat medics, not even doctors. The manual covered procedures and protocols that would have been considered advanced in German field hospitals. Each American medic carried a kit with supplies that a German surgeon would have envied: morphine syrettes, sulfa powder, plasma, proper bandages. We found that investing in medical training for frontline troops reduces casualty mortality significantly, Morrison explained. It's not just about having good hospitals in the rear, it's about providing immediate care at the point of injury. Systems thinking, industrial thinking. The American approach to war wasn't just about having more tanks or planes. It was about optimizing every aspect of the military apparatus, including how you kept soldiers alive. Müller remembered reading German military doctrine about acceptable casualty rates. Losses were expected, tolerated, absorbed. The idea of systematically reducing casualties through better medical care hadn't been a priority. You won through superior tactics and fighting spirit, not by coddling wounded soldiers. Except the Americans had proven you could do both. You could have fighting spirit and industrial efficiency. You could value human life and still be devastatingly effective at war. In May, a Red Cross representative visited the camp for an inspection. Müller watched as the inspector reviewed medical records, examined facilities, and interviewed prisoners. The inspection was thorough, professional, documented. The inspector made suggestions for improvements, minor things like better ventilation in one barracks section. Morrison accepted the suggestions without defensiveness, made notes, and explained when changes would be implemented. The idea that prison conditions should be inspected by neutral parties, that standards existed and were enforced, that improvement was an ongoing process rather than a final state. These concepts felt revolutionary. In Germany, the camps, Müller made himself think the word. The concentration camps had been state secrets. No inspections, no oversight, no standards except the whim of whoever held power. He'd known about them, vaguely. Everyone had known, vaguely. You didn't ask questions. You told yourself it wasn't your responsibility. You focused on your work, your patients, your immediate sphere of control. Now he was a prisoner in an American camp, receiving better medical care than most Germans back home, and he had to confront what that contrast meant. The breaking point came in late June, during a surgical procedure. A German prisoner had been brought in with a compound fracture, his leg broken in 2 places during a logging accident. The bone had pierced the skin. In a German field hospital, this would have meant probable amputation. Infection risk was too high, resources too scarce to attempt complex repair. Chen decided to attempt surgical reconstruction. The fracture is clean enough, he explained to Müller, who was assisting. With proper stabilization and antibiotic coverage, we should be able to save the leg with full function. Should be able to, the casual optimism of it. They operated in the camp's surgical suite. The anesthesia was smooth. Modern equipment, pure gases, careful monitoring. The lighting was brilliant, shadowless. Chen worked methodically, realigning the bone fragments, installing metal pins to hold everything in place. The surgical instruments were sharp, precisely manufactured, designed for this exact procedure. Müller assisted, his hands remembering the choreography of surgery from better days: retractor, suction, clamp. The familiar dance of sterile protocol. It took 3 hours. When they finished, the leg was reconstructed. Chen closed the wound carefully, layer by layer, using sutures that wouldn't need to be reused because there were more in the supply cabinet. "We'll start him on penicillin immediately," Chen said. "Daily injections for 10 days. The infection risk should be minimal, but I don't take chances with compound fractures." Daily injections for 10 days. 70 doses of penicillin, used to save one prisoner's leg. Müller stood in the surgical suite after the patient had been moved to recovery. His hands were shaking again. He looked at Chen, this Chinese-American doctor, and tried to find words for what he was feeling. "In Germany," he said finally, "that soldier would have lost his leg, probably his life." Chen was cleaning his instruments. "Maybe. Or maybe German surgeons would have figured out a way to save it. You're good doctors. I've watched you work." "We didn't have this," Müller gestured at the room, "the equipment, the supplies, the infrastructure of industrial medicine. We didn't have any of this." "No," Chen agreed. "You didn't. You understand what that means?" Müller's voice was rising. "We lost the war before it started, not because our soldiers weren't brave or our tactics weren't good. We lost because your country could build this," he gestured again, "for prisoners, while we couldn't build it for our own people." Chen set down the instrument he was cleaning. "Yes," he said simply, "everything we believed, everything we were told about superiority and destiny and thousand-year Reichs, all of it was a lie. We were never superior. We were already beaten. We just didn't know it." "Belief systems," Chen said carefully, "can be very powerful. They can make you see what isn't there and not see what is." Müller laughed, a harsh sound. "We thought we were the master race, the pinnacle of human civilization. And you were treating your prisoners better than we treated our own citizens." "Your regime treated your own citizens badly," Chen corrected. "That wasn't an accident or a resource limitation. It was a choice." The words hit like a surgical blade, clean and precise. Choice, not necessity, not the inevitable mathematics of total war. Choice. Germany could have built different systems, could have valued different things, could have organized society around human dignity instead of racial mythology. The resources had existed. They'd been spent on death camps and propaganda and a war machine built on slave labor instead of on medicine and welfare and infrastructure. "I knew," Müller said. His voice was shaking. "About the camps, the extermination. I didn't see them directly, but I knew. Everyone knew." Chen said nothing. "I told myself it wasn't my responsibility, that I was just a doctor, that my job was to treat the patients in front of me, not to question policy, that individuals couldn't change the system." "Maybe they couldn't," Chen said, "or maybe that's what everyone told themselves so they didn't have to try." Müller sat down heavily on a stool. "You must hate us." Chen considered this. "I hate what was done, the systems that were built, the choices that were made, but individual people." He shrugged. "You're my patients now. That's what matters." Because they're patients. Müller put his face in his hands. He had operated on thousands of soldiers, German soldiers. He'd worked until he collapsed night after night, trying to save lives. He'd thought he was doing noble work, serving his country, upholding medical ethics in the face of chaos. And all the time, while he was saving German soldiers, those same soldiers were murdering civilians. While he was following his Hippocratic oath in his sphere of control, others were violating every human principle in theirs. And he'd known. And he'd done nothing. "I can't go back," he said. "To Germany? To who I was. I can't go back to believing any of it. The world I understood is gone." Chen pulled up a stool and sat across from him. "Good." Müller looked up, surprised. "The world you understood was built on lies," Chen said. "It needed to be gone. What you build now, that's what matters." The summer passed. Müller worked in the camp infirmary, treating prisoners, learning new techniques, slowly rebuilding his understanding of what medicine could be. He wrote to his wife in Hamburg, letters carefully censored but still meaningful. She wrote back. The city was ruins. Food was scarce, but she was alive. Their 2 daughters were alive. That was enough. Werner specialized in orthopedic cases, working alongside Chen on complex reconstructions. His hands, damaged by frostbite, were still capable. He was still a surgeon. Zimmermann focused on chronic condition management, carefully documenting treatments and outcomes. He told Müller one night, This is what I should have been doing all along. Real medicine, not triage in a field hospital while a criminal regime destroyed everything we should have valued. Young Hoffman absorbed everything like a sponge. He'd known only war medicine, only scarcity and death. Now he was learning what medicine looked like in peacetime, in a functional society. He told Müller, "When we go home, this is what I want to build. This system, this approach." In August, the war ended completely. Japan surrendered. The world began the slow, painful process of counting its dead and confronting its sins. News filtered into the camp. The full horror of the concentration camps, not rumors anymore, but documented, photographed, undeniable. Müller read the reports, looked at the photographs smuggled into the camp by prisoners who received newspapers. Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, Auschwitz. He'd known, but knowing abstractly and seeing the photographic evidence were different things. The piles of bodies, the skeletal survivors, the industrial architecture of genocide. Chen found him one afternoon sitting alone behind the infirmary, holding a newspaper with shaking hands. "I knew," Müller said again. "I knew, and I did nothing." "What could you have done?" Chen asked. "I don't know. Something. Anything. Resigned my position, refused to participate, spoken out. And died. Or been arrested. And then what? Someone else would have filled your position. Someone else would have treated those soldiers." "Is that supposed to make me feel better?" "No," Chen said. "It's supposed to help you understand that moral clarity is easier in retrospect. What matters is what you do now." Müller looked at the camp around him. Prisoners playing soccer in the yard, guards chatting with prisoners, sharing cigarettes. The infirmary where he'd learned to practice medicine, the way it should be practiced. "What do I do now?" "You go home," Chen said, "whenever they let you. You go back to Germany, and you help rebuild it. You make sure what happened never happens again. You teach young doctors that medicine means treating every patient with dignity, regardless of who they are. You build systems based on humanity instead of ideology. How? The same way we built this." Chen gestured at the camp, at America beyond it. "One decision at a time, one patient at a time. Choosing humanity every time you have the choice." Activate. Return. Müller was repatriated in November 1946, 18 months after his capture. He sailed from New York back to Hamburg, carrying with him a complete set of medical textbooks given to him by Chen and Morrison, a recommendation letter, and a fundamentally altered understanding of everything he'd believed. The Germany he returned to was rubble. Hamburg was a ghost of itself, 80% destroyed by bombing. The Charité Hospital in Berlin was partially standing but gutted. The medical system had collapsed entirely. Doctors operated without electricity, without supplies, often without hope. But Müller had something most didn't have. He'd seen what was possible. He found work at a makeshift hospital in Hamburg's British occupation zone. The conditions were medieval compared to what he'd experienced in New Hampshire. They operated in damaged buildings with salvaged equipment, treating patients who were starving and traumatized. But he approached it differently now. He insisted on maintaining patient records even when it seemed pointless. He emphasized infection prevention even with limited supplies. He treated every patient, German civilian, displaced person, former concentration camp survivor, with the same methodical care Chen had demonstrated. Werner joined him after his own repatriation in early 1947. Together they began writing protocols, training younger doctors, building systems from nothing. Zimmermann went to Munich, where he helped reorganize the teaching hospital. Hoffman worked in a rural clinic, bringing American medical practices to villages that had barely known 20th century medicine, even before the war. They stayed in contact through letters, compared notes, shared techniques, built networks. In 1949, Müller was appointed to help organize medical care in the newly forming Federal Republic of Germany. He pushed for universal health care, arguing, using data from the American POW camps, that comprehensive medical access improved overall societal health and productivity. The authorities listened. They were building a new Germany, after all. They needed new ideas, new systems, new ways of thinking that weren't contaminated by the Nazi past. By 1960, West Germany had built one of the most comprehensive healthcare systems in Europe: universal coverage, modern hospitals, a pharmaceutical industry rebuilt on quality and oversight, medical ethics codified in law. Müller lived to see it. He retired in 1972 at 70 after training 3 generations of German doctors. At his retirement ceremony, a young doctor, a woman, which would have been unthinkable in Müller's youth, asked him about his career. "What was the most important lesson you learned?" she asked. Müller thought about that infirmary in New Hampshire, the X-ray machine, the shelves of penicillin. Chen explaining that patients were patients regardless of anything else. "That civilization," he said, "is measured not by how you treat your own people in prosperity, but by how you treat strangers in crisis. That medicine is a human right, not a privilege. And that anyone who tells you some people deserve dignity and others don't is leading you toward catastrophe." The young doctor nodded, writing this down. Müller wondered if she understood, if anyone who hadn't lived through what he'd lived through could really understand. But perhaps that was the point, to build systems so good that people took them for granted, never knowing how precious they were because they'd never known the alternative. February 1975. Hamburg. Friedrich Müller was 73 years old, retired, living in a small apartment overlooking the rebuilt harbor. Hamburg had risen from its ruins, modern, prosperous, unrecognizable from the nightmare landscape he'd returned to in 1946. A young American historian came to interview him, a doctoral student researching medical care in POW camps. The historian had found Müller's name in Camp Stark's records, listed as one of the German doctors who'd worked in the infirmary. They sat in Müller's living room, drinking coffee. Real coffee, Brazilian, purchased without thought at the corner shop. Small miracles of peacetime prosperity. "What I'm trying to understand," the historian said, "is the psychological impact. You'd been told your whole life that Germans were superior, that the Reich represented the pinnacle of civilization, and then you saw that American prisoner camps had better medical facilities than German hospitals. How did you process that?" Müller watched the harbor for a moment. Container ships unloading cargo, the machinery of global trade, the networks of peace and commerce that had replaced the machinery of war. "You have to understand," he said slowly, "it wasn't just the equipment. Equipment is just metal and glass. It was what the equipment represented." "Which was?" "Choice," Müller said. "Moral choice. Americans chose to build that system. They chose to treat prisoners as human beings deserving medical care. They chose to value life, even enemy life, enough to invest resources in preserving it." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "Germany made different choices. We chose ideology over humanity. We chose racial mythology over medical ethics. We chose conquest over compassion. And we told ourselves it was necessary, that we had no choice, that circumstances forced our hand." "But you did have choices," the historian said. "Yes. We always had choices. We just didn't want to see them." The historian made notes. "Did seeing the American system change how you practiced medicine after the war?" Müller smiled slightly. "It changed everything. I spent the rest of my career trying to build in Germany what I'd seen in that camp. Not just the equipment, the philosophy. The idea that every patient deserves dignity and comprehensive care. That medicine isn't about rationing salvation, but providing it universally. Did you succeed?" Müller gestured vaguely at the world outside his window. "Look around. Universal health care, modern hospitals, medical research, ethics committees, oversight, accountability. It's not perfect. Nothing human ever is. But it's so much better than what we had. Because of what you learned in that camp? Because of what thousands of people learned in thousands of ways when the Reich fell, and we had to confront what we'd become. The camp was just my particular education." The historian asked more questions, filled more notebooks. Eventually he left, thanking Müller for his time. Müller sat alone afterward, watching the sun set over Hamburg harbor. He thought about Chen, who'd retired from the Army Medical Corps years ago and was teaching at a hospital in San Francisco. They still exchanged letters occasionally, brief updates, medical journal articles, the small connections of an unlikely friendship. He thought about the German prisoner whose leg Chen had saved, who'd returned to Germany and become a schoolteacher. He thought about Werner, dead now for 3 years, but who'd rebuilt orthopedic surgery in Germany from rubble. He thought about Zimmermann and Hoffman and the hundreds of other doctors who'd seen something in those camps, something that contradicted everything they'd been taught, and had chosen to learn from it rather than deny it. He thought about that box of penicillin on a shelf in New Hampshire 30 years ago, and how it had shattered his world more effectively than any bomb. The greatest shock hadn't been the technological gap, though that had been real and devastating. The greatest shock had been the moral gap. The realization that their enemies were better people, building better societies, making better choices. That superiority had nothing to do with race or blood or national mythology, and everything to do with how you treated the most vulnerable, the most powerless, the least deserving of compassion. Müller had spent 30 years trying to teach that lesson to young doctors who took universal health care for granted, to students who couldn't imagine medicine practiced any other way, to a generation that had grown up in prosperity and peace and couldn't conceive of the alternative. Perhaps that was success, creating a world where the lesson seemed obvious, where the moral architecture was so sound that no one questioned its foundations. Or perhaps each generation had to learn the lesson again in its own way, had to confront its own temptations toward cruelty, its own rationalizations for dehumanization, had to choose, actively and consciously, to build systems based on human dignity rather than human hierarchy. He hoped they would choose well. He'd done what he could. Outside, the harbor lights came on, illuminating the rebuilt city. Modern, prosperous, peaceful, built on the ruins of catastrophe, constructed from the lessons of horror, maintained by the constant choice to remember and never repeat. In 1945, Friedrich Müller had stood in an American POW camp and seen a box of penicillin that proved his entire worldview was wrong. In 1975, he sat in a rebuilt city and hoped that wrongness, acknowledged and learned from, had helped build something right. That was the measurement of civilization he'd learned. Not what you built at your peak, but what you learned from your fall. Not how you treated your own at your strongest, but how you treated strangers at your weakest. Not the machinery of death you could construct, but the machinery of healing you chose to maintain. The harbor lights reflected off the water, steady and bright. The coffee in his cup had gone cold, but that was all right. There was always more coffee in peacetime. There was always the possibility of warmth. Outside, the city that had been destroyed was alive again, imperfect and struggling and trying day by day to be better than what came before. That, Müller thought, was enough. That was everything. Camp Stark, New Hampshire, operated from 1944 to 1946, housing approximately 1,400 German POWs who worked in local lumber and pulp industries. Medical care at American POW camps during WW2 was governed by Geneva Convention requirements and generally exceeded those standards, with comprehensive facilities, medication, and trained personnel. By 1945, the United States was producing penicillin at industrial scale, 650 billion units per month, while Germany's production remained negligible. American POW camps had access to medications, equipment, and supplies that were unavailable in most German civilian hospitals by war's end. The medical personnel in this narrative are fictionalized, but their experiences reflect documented realities. German prisoners consistently reported shock at the quality of American medical care, and many German doctors who served as POWs in the United States did return to help rebuild Germany's medical system after the war. The Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany, established universal health care in the 1950s and 1960s, building one of the world's most comprehensive medical systems. While many factors contributed to this development, the contrast between wartime scarcity and post-war reconstruction played a significant role in shaping medical policy. The true measure of civilization remains contested, but history suggests it may be found not in how a society treats its best citizens, but in how it treats its prisoners.